On the night of May 29th, 1944, something happened that the American Navy thought was impossible. A lone German U-boat, heavily damaged, operating with only 12% battery capacity and a malfunctioning diving plane, broke through a defensive ring of 6 destroyers. Its target was the biggest prize in the Atlantic, an American aircraft carrier. What unfolded in the hours that followed would forever alter the history of the U-boat war. Because U-549, under Lieutenant Commander Detlev Krankenhagen, did the impossible. It sank USS Block Island, the only American aircraft carrier ever lost in the Atlantic. This story isn't a legend. It's documented history, and it begins weeks before that fateful night. U-549 was a Type C-40 U-boat built at the German shipyard in Hamburg, 251 feet, 8 inches long, 22 feet, 6 inches wide, armed with 22 torpedoes in 4 bow tubes and 2 stern tubes. One of the most advanced underwater weapons of its time, the Type C-40 was a further development of the proven Type 9 class. Longer range than the smaller Type 7 boats, improved living conditions for the crew, and most importantly, more torpedoes. Because in the U-boat war, torpedoes were everything. Each torpedo was a chance for a sinking. Each torpedo fired was one less chance to win. U-549 carried 22 of these deadly weapons, enough for multiple attacks. Enough to decimate a convoy, enough to make history, but the true strength of a U-boat never lay in its steel or its weapons. It lay in its men, in their training, in their discipline, in their will to prevail. And Lieutenant Commander Detlev Krankenhagen was a commander who drove his crew to peak performance. Born in 1916 in Bremen, son of a seafaring family. His father had already served at sea in World War I. For young Detlev, the Navy wasn't a choice. It was destiny. At the age of 20, he joined the German Navy. The training was harsh. Months aboard the sailing training ship Gorsch Fock, then U-boat school in Neustadt. There, the young men learned what it meant to fight in a steel coffin underwater. The training lasted months. Theory and practice, torpedo firing and damage control, navigation and engineering. A U-boat commander had to know everything, be able to do everything, be responsible for everything. Krankenhagen completed his training with distinction. His superiors noted calm under pressure, determined, able to make difficult decisions. Qualities that would cost him his life on May 29, 1944. After several war patrols as a watch officer on other boats, Krankenhagen received command of U-549 in December 1943, an honor and a burden at the same time. Because 1943 had been the year the U-boat war turned. The Allies had cracked the code of the Enigma machine. They knew where the German boats were operating. They could hunt them before the boats found their prey. Krankenhagen took command in a time when U-boat commanders were no longer heroes. They were martyrs. His first war patrol with the new boat began on April 12, 1944. The target was the American East Coast. But Krankenhagen knew that times had changed. 1944 was no longer 1942. The lucky days when German U-boats could sink American ships almost unhindered were over. The Allies had learned. Their radar technology had improved. Their aircraft were more numerous. Their tactics deadlier. For every freighter sunk, the U-boat force now paid a terrible price. In May 1943, Admiral Dönitz had lost 41 U-boats in just 1 month. Black May, a trauma that had changed the entire U-boat force, but Krankenhagen still sailed out, because it was his duty, because his comrades were doing it. Because a German sailor didn't ask if a mission was dangerous. The first week was quiet. U-549 operated southeast of New York. The boat remained at depth during the day to avoid Allied aircraft. At night, it surfaced to charge the batteries and get fresh air. Then came enemy contact. It was May 26, 1944. The men in the listening room reported the sound of screws. Many screws. This wasn't a single merchant ship. This was a convoy, or worse. Krankenhagen ordered periscope depth. What he saw took his breath away. It was a hunter-killer group, the most dangerous thing a U-boat could encounter in the Atlantic. An aircraft carrier surrounded by a ring of destroyers. Their sole task was to find and destroy German U-boats. Any other commander would have turned away, would have disappeared, would have avoided certain death, but Krankenhagen saw something else. He saw an opportunity. The carrier was USS Block Island, a Bogue-class escort carrier, 497 feet long, about 9,000 tons displacement, 21 aircraft on board, a mix of Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and FM-2 Wildcat fighters. These escort carriers were the nemesis of the U-boats. Their aircraft could search vast areas of the ocean. They could track down U-boats that were on the surface. They could drop depth charges and fire rockets. Since the beginning of 1944, these hunter-killer groups had sunk dozens of German U-boats. They had turned the Atlantic into a graveyard for the grey wolves. USS Block Island itself had already participated in the sinking of U-801 and U-1059. The carrier was an experienced hunter. Its pilots were veterans. But on this day, the hunter was also the prey, because Krankenhagen had noticed something that others might have overlooked. The destroyer ring had a gap. Small but present. If he managed to slip through this gap unnoticed, then he would have a clear shot at the carrier. But first he had to wait. Patience was the most important weapon of a U-boat commander. More important than torpedoes, more important than speed, patience, and the ability to recognize the right moment. For 3 days, U-549 followed the hunter-killer group, always at a distance, always at a safe depth, always listening, always waiting. The crew felt the tension. 52 men in a steel tube underwater. The air was getting stale. The oxygen content was dropping. Carbon dioxide was building up. The men were breathing harder, faster. The batteries were getting weaker with each hour. Electricity was life underwater. Without electricity, the electric motors couldn't run. Without electric motors, no propulsion. Without propulsion, only drifting and waiting. And the pressure wasn't just physical. It was the psychological pressure that could break men. The knowledge that the enemy circled above them. The knowledge that every moment could be their last. Inside a U-boat, there was no escape, no way out. If the boat went down, they all went down with it. The men knew this, every single one of them. Some crews broke under this pressure. Men lost their minds, screamed, cried, prayed. But the crew of U-549 was different. Lieutenant Commander Krankenhagen had molded them. For months he had trained them, had taught them to remain calm when all seemed lost, had taught them to trust their comrades, had taught them to trust him. Nobody complained. They knew what their commander was planning, and they trusted him with their lives. On the morning of May 29th, the unexpected happened. A depth charge exploded near U-549, not close enough to destroy the boat, but close enough to cause damage. The diving plane jammed, one of the most important mechanisms of a U-boat. Without a functioning diving plane, a boat could not dive properly, could not surface properly, could not maneuver properly. The engineers worked feverishly. Hours passed. They managed to repair the rudder just enough. It worked again, but not as precisely as before, and the batteries. Due to the extended dive, they had dropped to 12%, a critical level. Normally, a commander would have aborted now, would have surfaced, would have charged the batteries, but surfacing meant discovery, and discovery meant death. Lieutenant Commander Krankenhagen faced the hardest decision of his life. Abort and live, or attack and maybe die. He chose to attack. The sun sank on the horizon. Twilight came, and with it, Lieutenant Commander Krankenhagen's chance. At 8:13 p.m., he ordered battle stations. 52 men took their places. The torpedo tubes were flooded, the T-3 torpedoes armed. The T-3s were the German Navy's latest acoustic torpedoes, also known as GNAT, German Naval Acoustic Torpedo. They tracked the sound of the enemy's screws. Once fired, they found their target themselves. These torpedoes were a revolution. Earlier torpedoes traveled straight. The commander had to predict where the target would be when the torpedo arrived. A complicated mathematical problem. And often enough, the calculation was wrong. The T-3s changed everything. They heard the target's screws. They corrected their course. They followed the sound like a dog follows a scent. There was little defense against such weapons. The Allies had developed foxes, noise buoys that were towed behind the ships to distract the torpedoes, but not every ship had foxes, and not every foxer worked. Lieutenant Commander Krankenhagen had 3 of these deadly hunters in the bow tubes, 3 chances to hit the carrier. But first, he had to get through the destroyer screen. He brought U-549 to periscope depth, just deep enough not to be seen, just high enough to see through the periscope. The destroyers circled the carrier like sharks around their prey. Their sonar devices scanned the water. Their depth charge launchers were loaded. They were just waiting for a signal. Lieutenant Commander Krankenhagen saw the gap between USS Bar and USS Eugene E. Elmore, 2 destroyers that were just making their turns. For maybe 10 minutes, the gap would be open. 10 minutes to sink an aircraft carrier. Slowly, like a predator, U-549 slipped through the opening. The men in the boat held their breath. Every noise could betray them, every false maneuver. The seconds stretched into eternities. Sweat poured, hearts hammered. And then Lieutenant Commander Krankenhagen was through. Before him lay USS Block Island, big, vulnerable, unaware. The distance was 1,200 meters, ideal firing range. At 8:31 p.m., Lieutenant Commander Krankenhagen gave the order. Tube 1, fire. The first torpedo raced through the water, 28 knots, 800 meters per minute. In less than 90 seconds, it would reach its target. Tube 2, fire. The second torpedo followed. Tube 3, fire. 3 T-3 torpedoes. 3 deadly hunters. On their way to USS Block Island, the seconds ticked by. Lieutenant Commander Krankenhagen counted in his head. 50, 60, 70. Then came the first explosion. A huge fireball lit up the night. The torpedo had hit midships, right where the fuel tanks were located. Seconds later, the second explosion. Aft, in the engine room. USS Block Island was burning. The fire spread rapidly. Within minutes, it had engulfed the entire hangar deck. The aircraft on the deck exploded one after another. Their fuel tanks were full, their ammunition magazines loaded. Each explosion triggered the next, a fireworks display of death. The crew fought desperately. Firefighting teams ran through the corridors. Hoses were unrolled, water pumped. But it wasn't enough. The fire was stronger. The water flooding in through the torpedo holes was stronger. Gravity was stronger. The carrier listed, first slowly, then faster. The men below deck were no longer just fighting the fire. They were fighting to stay on their feet. They were fighting to get up the stairs. They were fighting for their lives. In the engine room, all hell had broken loose. The water was up to the men's waists. The engines were still running, but they wouldn't be for long. The mechanics knew they didn't stand a chance. Nevertheless, they remained at their posts until the end. At 9 p.m., Captain Francis Marion Hughes gave the order to abandon ship. It was the hardest decision of his life. 956 men jumped into the water. The cold, dark Atlantic water. Their ship burned all around them. At 9:12 p.m., USS Block Island disappeared beneath the waves, the only American aircraft carrier ever sunk in the Atlantic. But the story wasn't over yet. The destroyers now knew that a U-boat was beneath them, and they wanted revenge. USS Aarons and USS Eugene E. Elmore immediately began the search. Their sonar devices systematically scanned every square meter. Lieutenant Commander Krankenhagen tried to escape, but with only 12% battery and a damaged diving plane, his options were limited. He went deep, 150 meters, 180 meters, deeper than the boat was supposed to go. The diving depth of a Type 9 was officially limited to 230 meters. But that was a theoretical number. In practice, the steel cracked at such depths. Rivets popped, welds tore. The steel groaned under the pressure. Every man in the boat heard it. The creaking, the moaning of the metal. It was as if the boat itself was screaming. At 200 meters, water began to seep in. Small trickles at first, but they grew stronger. The men stuffed rags into the cracks. They pressed their hands against the leaks. They prayed. But Lieutenant Commander Krankenhagen continued to descend. Because he knew that the depth charges were less effective at that depth, because he hoped the Americans wouldn't find him there. The first depth charge exploded at 9:47 p.m., too far away to cause damage, but close enough to shake the men on board. Then came the second, closer. The third, even closer. The Americans had located them, and they weren't giving up. Hour after hour, the hunt continued. U-549 tried every trick the crew knew, releasing decoys. These small capsules created a cloud of air bubbles that looked like a U-boat on sonar. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, changing course, turning suddenly to port, then to starboard, confusing the pursuers, giving them no clear trail, changing depth, going up to 50 meters, then back down to 150. Taking advantage of the water's temperature layers, these layers could deflect sonar waves. A boat could hide in them, but the batteries were almost dead. The display read 5%, then 3%, then 2%. The boat was losing maneuverability. The electric motors were running on fumes. Every movement cost precious power. The circle was closing. The Americans knew where they were, and they were not giving up. At 2:43 a.m. on May 30th, a depth charge hit directly. The pressure wave tore the boat open. Water rushed into the engine room. The lights went out. Lieutenant Commander Krankenhagen knew it was over. He gave the order to surface, one last time, not to fight, but to give his men a chance. U-549 broke the surface, heavily damaged, sinking, a black silhouette against the night sky. The destroyers immediately opened fire. Their 40mm guns hammered the boat. Tracer rounds cut through the darkness. A hail of steel. The boat was hit once, twice, dozens of times. The shells pierced the conning tower. They killed men who were trying to get on deck. Some men managed to jump overboard. They leapt into the cold black water. They swam away from their sinking boat. They fought for their lives. Most didn't make it. They were trapped below deck. The water was rising too quickly. The hatch was blocked. They had no chance. At 2:58 a.m., U-549 disappeared beneath the waves of the Atlantic. Forever. Of the 52 men on board, only 3 survived. They were picked up by USS Eugene E. Elmore and spent the rest of the war in American captivity. Lieutenant Commander Detlev Krankenhagen was not among them. He went down with his boat, like so many U-boat commanders before him, like so many after him. The numbers from that night are staggering. USS Block Island lost 6 men in the attack. 950 were rescued. U-549 lost 49 men. Only 3 survived. An aircraft carrier against a U-boat, 6 against 49. The math of the U-boat war was grim. But the story has more than just numbers. It has heroism on both sides. The men on USS Block Island fought to the end to save their ship. The men on U-549 fought to the end to complete their mission. It has tragedy. Young men who gave their lives for flags and ideals they hadn't chosen, Germans and Americans alike. And it has a lesson. That courage knows no nationality. That duty wears no uniform. That human greatness is revealed in the darkest moments. Lieutenant Commander Detlev Krankenhagen was 28 years old when he died. He left behind no wife, no children, only a name in the history books, and the memory of a night when a single U-boat did the impossible. The files of the U.S. Naval Archives record the attack soberly. Date, time, coordinates, losses, but there's more between the lines. There is the story of men who did their duty, on both sides of the periscope. There is the story of a commander who faced an impossible choice and chose to attack. There is the story of 49 German sailors who never came home, whose graves lie at the bottom of the Atlantic forever. USS Block Island was the only American aircraft carrier lost in the Atlantic. That fact is in every history book, but few know the story behind it. The story of U-549, of Lieutenant Commander Detlev Krankenhagen, of 52 men in a steel tube underwater. Now you know it too. What impresses me most about this story isn't the attack itself, it's the decision before it. Krankenhagen knew what he was risking. He knew that his chances of escape were minimal. He knew he would probably die. And he attacked anyway, not out of fanaticism, not out of hate, but because he believed it was his duty. You can argue about the meaning of such duty. You can ask if it was worth it. You can condemn the whole system that demanded such sacrifices, but you can't deny that it took real courage, the courage to do what was right, at least what you thought was right, even if the price was your own death. That's perhaps the true lesson of this story. Not that war is glorious, it never is, but that humans are capable of incredible things, for better or worse. And that history isn't just made of dates and facts, but of people, of their decisions, of their courage, of their sacrifice. U-549 still lies on the bottom of the Atlantic today, about 400 nautical miles southeast of New York, a silent grave for 49 German sailors. No one visits this grave, no flowers are laid, no prayers are spoken, but the story lives on, in the archives of the Navy, in the memories of descendants, in videos like this one, because some stories deserve to be told, because some sacrifices deserve to be remembered. Because some truths deserve to be known. The U-boat war in the Atlantic cost the lives of about 30,000 German sailors. Out of 40,000 who went to sea, a loss rate of 75%. For comparison, the Luftwaffe lost about 50% of its crews, the Panzer Force about 35%. The infantry varied greatly, but even in the toughest battles, it rarely reached those numbers. The U-boat arm was the deadliest of all branches of service, and their men knew it. With every departure from port, they looked back at the boats that had not returned. With every dive, they thought of the comrades lying on the seabed. With every enemy contact, they wondered if this would be their last, and yet they climbed aboard, again and again. The psychology behind it is complex. Duty played a role, camaraderie, the desire not to let down your buddies, perhaps also fatalism. If fate was already decided, why fight it? But above all, it was something else. It was the refusal to let fear win over duty, the refusal to be less than their comrades, the refusal to give up. The men who climbed into U-boats knew that the probability of dying was higher than surviving. And they climbed in anyway, day after day, month after month, year after year. This is not a glorification of war. This is an acknowledgement of courage, of duty, of human strength under inhuman conditions. The story of U-549 is just one of thousands. Every sunken U-boat has its story. Every dead sailor had a name, a face, a family. But this story is special because it shows what people are capable of when they give their all. Because it shows that a single boat can challenge an entire carrier group. Because it shows that history is sometimes written in a single night. On May 29, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Detlev Krankenhagen wrote history. He paid with his life. His crew paid with their lives, but the story lives on, and as long as it lives, they are not forgotten. That's perhaps the only thing we can do for the fallen. Tell their stories, speak their names, remember their sacrifice, not to glorify war, but to honor the people who endured it. U-549, Lieutenant Commander Detlev Krankenhagen, 49 German sailors. Rest in peace, but the story has an afterword that is rarely told. After the war, the three survivors of U-549 returned to Germany. Heinrich Schütz, Karl Winkler and Dieter Hartmann, three men who had survived the impossible. They rarely spoke about that night, like so many veterans. They carried their memories silently, the nightmares, the guilt, the question of why they had survived and 49 of their comrades had not. The families of the fallen received the usual notifications: missing in action, later, killed in action, no bodies to bury, no graves to visit, just a date and a position in the Atlantic. In Bremen, the hometown of Lieutenant Commander Krankenhagen, hardly anyone knew about his deed. The war went on. Other news dominated, and then the war was over, and Germany had other worries. Only decades later, when historians sifted through the archives, did the full story become known. The story of U-549 and USS Block Island. The story of one night in May 1944. The documentation continues. In the following weeks, the U.S. Navy tried to figure out exactly what had happened that night. The reports of the survivors of USS Block Island were collected. The three surviving German sailors were interrogated. What emerged was astonishing. The Americans had not even suspected that U-549 had been following them for 3 days. Their sonar equipment had never detected the boat. Their aircraft had never seen it. Krankenhagen had steered his boat with unbelievable precision. Always just deep enough, always just quiet enough, always just invisible enough. Only the attack itself had betrayed U-549. The three survivors, whose names are listed in the files as Heinrich Schütz, Karl Winkler, and Dieter Hartmann, reported on the last hours aboard. They spoke of the silence before the attack, of the tension as the torpedoes were fired, of the joy when the explosions came, and of the fear when the depth charges began. They spoke of Lieutenant Commander Krankenhagen, how he remained calm until the end, how he gave every order clearly and precisely, how he refused to panic, and how he stood on the bridge at the end as the boat went down, his cap on his head, his gaze fixed on the sea, calm as in a drill. The survivors said he did not tremble, did not scream, just stood there and did his duty until the very end. The last words one of the survivors heard from him were, "Abandon ship, save yourselves." No dramatic speech, no heroic pose, just an order that saved his men's lives. 3 of them survived because Krankenhagen thought of his crew until the last moment. That is leadership, not the leadership from textbooks, but the leadership that counts when it counts, when all seems lost, when death is closer than the next shore. The American interrogating officers noted in their reports that the 3 German survivors spoke of their commander with the greatest respect, even though he had led them into death, even though they were prisoners because of him. That says more about Detlev Krankenhagen than any statistic. The tactical analysis of the attack was carried out years later by the U.S. Naval War College. The result was clear. Krankenhagen's attack was executed with near-perfect precision. The choice of timing, the exploitation of the gap in the destroyer ring, the firing position, the torpedo settings, everything was precisely calculated. The analysts noted that very few U-boat commanders would have been capable of such an attack. The combination of patience, timing, and precision was exceptional. They also noted that the attack was practically a suicide mission. With damaged dive planes and nearly depleted batteries, U-549 had little chance of escape. Krankenhagen must have known that. He attacked anyway. The question of why he did it cannot be answered with certainty. The dead do not speak. Their motives go down with them. But we can speculate. Perhaps Krankenhagen believed that an aircraft carrier was too important a target to ignore. These carriers were the deadliest enemies of the U-boats. A sunken carrier meant dozens of U-boats that survived. Perhaps he felt the duty to give his all. The U-boat arm had suffered heavy losses in 1943 and 1944. Victory was slipping away from Germany. Every success was important for morale. Maybe it was simply what Lieutenant Commander Krankenhagen felt was right, as an officer, as a commander, as a man. Or perhaps it was something even simpler than that. Maybe Krankenhagen looked at that carrier and knew that if he didn't attack it, it would kill his comrades tomorrow. It would hunt other U-boats next week. It would send men like him and his crew to their deaths. And perhaps he thought, if I die here and now, but sink this carrier, then maybe I can save dozens of my comrades. It's a gruesome calculation. Life against life. But it's the calculation of war. The calculation that millions of soldiers had to make during that time. We will never know exactly what was going through Krankenhagen's head. The dead do not speak. Their motives are buried with them. What we do know is the result. A sunk carrier, a lost U-boat, 49 dead Germans, 6 dead Americans, and a story that is still being told 80 years later. The Atlantic keeps its secrets well. USS Block Island and U-549 both lie on the ocean floor, visited only by currents and fish. But the story lives on at the surface, in naval archives, in history books, in families who lost their loved ones. And now, here in this video, because some stories deserve not to be forgotten, because some sacrifices deserve to be remembered, because some truths deserve to be known. U-549 sank USS Block Island, the only American aircraft carrier ever lost in the Atlantic, with 12% battery, with a damaged diving plane, against a ring of 6 destroyers. This is not a legend. This is history. And history does not forget. If you haven't already subscribed, do it now. We need 1,000 subs to continue to grow and bring you stories like this. What moment of this story impressed you the most? Write it in the comments below. Until next time.